without any further ado, ladies and gentlemen, Janina Ramirez.
Thank you all for being here. This is some things I've done. There was a beautiful introduction there by Emma. And today I will be talking to you mostly about this book, Femina. And I will be talking about my search for medieval women who have been written out of history and why putting them back into our understanding of the past can help enrich our present and also help us build a fairer, more equal future. And when we're thinking about the present that we find ourselves in and the future that we're moving towards, whether we wake up tomorrow with a US female president or not, these are the countries that have had female heads of states or governments in the last century. To date, more than a third of countries in the world have had a female ruler, and currently 12, including Mexico, Italy, and Thailand, are ruled by women. But that position of the US president has always been held by a man. Will the glass ceiling ever be shattered? And can we learn to move forward by looking backwards? These are just some startling statistics about the lack of inequality globally between men and women. Some of the things here, that women enjoy less than 2/3 of the legal rights available to men. Gender pay gap is still 20%. And all these horrific statistics here about violence and contraception, access to contraception. So there is still work to be done as far as the division between male and female are concerned. And my work centres on women in history because as over 50% of the global population, they are the most obvious group that has been deliberately excluded from many historical narratives. However, I want to stress this. This lecture is not about binaries. It's not about dividing men from women, lumping together 50% of the population against 50% of the population. It's rather about asking why so many silenced voices are excluded from traditional history. Issues of race, disability, class, background, and sexuality are being foregrounded in all areas of academia now. But as the largest lens, I want to use women to challenge what has gone before and explore what we can do going forward. Right. But first, I'm taking you on a journey through time and space. Women's rights, they're barely a century old, right? We owe it all to the suffragettes, who dragged us from the position of the second sex to where we are today. And that's the traditional narrative. But what if I told you that isn't the full picture? Come with me to a summer's day in Epsom. It's 1913, and the Derby is about to take place. This is the most important sporting event of the year, and nearly 500,000 people are going to be moving towards this racecourse to witness these moments, these fleeting moments of horses racing. And as the starting pistol is going to crack, the horses are frothing and spitting. They explode out onto the track. Images are being captured on film, and they're going to be spread around the world. Now, the horses are nearing famous Tattenham Corner, reaching 70 kilometres an hour. But the cameras pick up something unexpected, because they can see that a figure has come out from underneath the railings. They're moving directly into the path of the king's horse, Anma. Everything's happening in seconds, but the figure seems to reach up. The horse tries to jump, and the rider is thrown off as two bodies fall to the ground. Who is this mysterious figure who was struck by the king's horse? It was the suffragette, Emily Wilding Davison. She died from her injuries and became the first martyr of the suffragette movement. I want to stress that the jockey, he also was thrown from his horse. He did recover, but he was so traumatized by what he'd experienced that he later took his life. And the poor horse, Anma, was blamed for this and sent to Canada in exile. That's what you do with a horse who had no responsibility for his actions whatsoever. But as a result of her death, 50,000 people lined the routes of her funerary procession. It was the single most attended non-royal funeral in English history. 5 years later, women gained the vote. So the stalling suffragette movement was really galvanized by her actions on this day. But there's something very few people know about Emily Wilding Davison, something that I'm excited about. She was a medievalist, like me. She had gone to Oxford University and she'd completed her finals in medieval literature, but because women weren't allowed to graduate at the time, she could not receive a full degree. Nevertheless, she continued to write hundreds of letters and articles on medieval topics, and she even called herself Fair Emily after Chaucer's famous character. Why does all this matter? Well, as a medievalist, I got excited by this following of the footnotes, and I started to dive into some of Emily's writings, and I found something interesting. As a suffragette, and one of the most militant and active of the suffragettes, she had a particular thing with blowing up letterboxes. She did not think she was breaking new ground by fighting for women's rights. Instead, she was arguing that women had rights in the past and that these had been taken away from them relatively recently. This isn't the way we think about history, is it? We tend to think it's just a constant uphill slope of progress, everyone standing on the shoulders of those that have gone before. But far more often, it's a corkscrew, a cyclical process. And what Emily was saying in her work was that there had been a time where women seemed to have opportunities and rights that had been denied to them in the following centuries. This, for me, was mind-blowing, so I dug further. Lots of the suffragettes, it seems, were fascinated by the medieval period. This is an image of her funeral, by the way. You can see the sorts of crowds that it attracted, and there is Emily herself. And there she is in the middle, not receiving her degree. They had Joan of Arc as their figurehead. So at the same time that Emily was at the Derby, she was supposed to be at the suffragette rally, which was being held in Kensington. And here you can see this enormous statue of Joan of Arc, which was what welcomed them to the suffragettes' rally. Joan of Arc became a figurehead. You can see in the posters, in the material. She was a perfect sort of rallying point for the suffragette movement because she had been dead for many centuries, so she wasn't a present-day threat, but she pushed all the boundaries. She dressed as a man. She fought in wars. She was this militant, active woman who was sort of pushing to reach beyond what was expected of her sex. And the motto that she fought under, which was "Fight on, and God will give the victory," that started to be wrapped up with the suffragette motto of deeds, not words. So what I found with looking again at the suffragettes and thinking about them as medievalists was that they weren't just trying to carve out a new path going forward. They were actually trying to return to one that had gone before, which we've now lost sight of. So that is my big opening on medieval women and suffragettes. But I've got another reason that I wanted to write this book and why I want to work on this material. A recent best-selling work on the early medieval period claimed that the women of the early medieval period were unrecoverable. And I wanted to challenge that. I wanted to see if that really was the case. There are reasons that women don't fare so well in written records. Texts can be edited, lost, destroyed, and overwritten. As we all know, books can be burnt. As each generation has picked and chosen which historical texts to preserve, expand, and copy, they've included narratives that suit their present-day needs. If those in power need to justify colonialism and imperialism, the historian gives them accounts of adventures and explorers going to distant lands. If they need to find soldiers ready to die for king and country, the historian gives them tales of battle, honour, and victory. So in many ways, the historian serves the ends of the generation of which they are a part. And I recognise my place in this too. No historian is free from bias. As much as we would like it to be an objective subject, it is a subjective one. And I bring my own interests, concerns, my ideas for how looking backwards can change our present and our future, as all historians have done before me. Now, if women don't emerge as easily in textual evidence, how do we find them? Well, we can combine texts with archaeology, art history, literature, theology, and we can bring new insights into individuals from the past. Plus, history is changing. Those areas that used to be pushed to the edges outside the traditional teaching of history. So I'm thinking social history, post-colonial history, women's history, local history. They're no longer just at the sidelines. They are moving into the centre. And we've had some incredibly important things happen. We've had Black Lives Matter, we've had Me Too. And those that have been excluded from the narratives are asking for their voices to be heard. That's why it's an exciting time to be looking to the past. I do a big sell on why people should study history. So I know we've got some students in the room today. This is my big sell to you. Yay! How about this? History is the mother subject, right? Because every other subject has a history. Maths has a history. Technology has a history. Computing has a history. And you don't understand where you are within your subject until you look back and find out how we got there. So in many ways, it is the greatest of subjects, but it's also the most exciting time to study history. Now, we have lived through a hugely significant historic moment, the pandemic. And for all that was so utterly awful about it, it did do one thing, which was drive resources online. Archives, records, things I get very excited about. Things that used to be hidden away, inaccessible, they have been made available. When I was at school, if I didn't have access to a good library, which I didn't, I was at a disadvantage to someone who did have access to a good library. It was about there wasn't that democratizing of access to information that we have now. Now, if you are curious about something, you can investigate it. You can really do that. And there's also been a major developments in science and technology. It's pushing the boundaries of what we can discover. DNA is bringing people that have been excluded from texts into the foreground. I'm going to be using an example today to talk about how we can learn more through DNA analysis. And we are starting to look for the many, not just the few. It's not just kings and queens we want to know about anymore. We also want to know about people like us, who have always been there, but have rarely made it into the historical records. And I think we are more aware than ever that history is written to serve agendas. I've said what mine is, to put women back into the past, to ensure we move forward with a new conversation. But I think we are all very aware of the idea that information and evidence can be manipulated. And that makes us all more cautious about how we study the past. And before I go off-piste and start doing my case studies with you, I just want to share a phrase with you that really hit me when I was beginning to think about writing this book. You cannot be what you cannot see. And when I was growing up, there were limits, I felt, to what I could achieve as a woman. There were areas that I couldn't go into. There were things that I wasn't suited for. But if we can see people before us that have trailblazed, people before us that have done things that we want to have the courage to do, I think that will encourage us all to be stronger and braver going forward. So that's why I think we need to find the women from the past. Okay. So there are some medieval women that people know better than others. And Joan of Arc is one of those. I mentioned her. Here I've also got Christine de Pizan. If you were watching the Olympics, there was that moment where all the women came out either side of the river, and Christine de Pizan was one of them. She's one of the first female writers to have run her own publishing house, to have written about the role of women. She wrote an incredible book called The City of Ladies. And these two women have never really been lost from the historical record. We've constantly been reminded of them. But in both cases, they've both been hijacked to the ends of the people that are using them. So, for example, Christine de Pizan has been called a feminist writer. Well, she was writing in the 14th century and had no concept of what the word feminism was. She was foregrounding women's positions, but she wasn't a feminist. And it's even more tricky when we get to Joan of Arc, because she has now become the banner of the party run by Jean-Marie Le Pen, which is further right than the National Front. He's set up a party called the Comte de Jean, literally named after Joan of Arc. And he uses her in these speeches that are just full of division and hatred. How is that connected to this woman who lived 600 years ago and achieved great things? So we have to be so cautious when we find our medieval figures, that we sieve back through the centuries, that we get back to the raw evidence and back to finding them. And I'm going to be talking about women. I'm going to do 3 different examples for you. One from the early medieval period, so we're talking sort of 500 to 1000. One from the high medieval period, about 1000 to 1250, and then one from the late medieval period, 1250 to 1400. And after the Black Death, which of course takes place in the 14th century, it seems that women really are sliding into all the positions held by men. A parallel would be during the World War, when soldiers were sent off to fight. There weren't enough men left to do a lot of the jobs, and so women took on those jobs and changed the whole sort of status quo. And this happened after the Black Death. If you imagine, in some places up to half the population died. You have a need that everyone that survives contributes and is included going forward. And in this world, women were doing everything. They were involved in trading, politics, economics, religion. Catherine of Siena even negotiates with 2 popes and multiple courts to break the Great Schism. It's a woman who ends up on the forefront of international politics. And yet, as we're seeing this moment coming up through the 1400s, towards the end of the 1400s, things start to change. What happens? The Reformation happens. Now, you would think, wouldn't you, that the Catholic Church is probably one of the less forgiving environments for women. But actually, what had happened over 1,400 years of Catholicism was that women had carved out spaces within the church that gave them quite a lot of power and autonomy. One of these is the convent. And this is where I have a really hard sell, because we have a vision in our head of what a convent is. It's a place where women leave behind all the nice, fun, great things of life, shut themselves up, and live a very sad, miserable existence. They might sort of wander through a herb garden with a cat, and that's about the extent of the fun they have. But a medieval convent was not like that at all. They were like miniature cities, powerhouses. They were the hospitals, the universities, the publishing houses, the artisanal workshops of the medieval period. And a lot of these places were vibrant, busy, full of luxury, and people could live well in them. So what really Catholicism gave was an option. Now, it's a small option. The majority of women in the medieval period would have lived lives of getting married, having children, working the land, working in the business. But there was this other door that could be opened, this door of opportunity. And behind that, a woman would be safe. They wouldn't have to give birth, which was, of course, a highly fatal thing to go through. They could learn, they could read, they could write, they could expand themselves spiritually and intellectually. But with the Reformation, the male monastic houses were closed, and the monks were given an option: pension, or you can join the new church. You can move over to the new church. But the women were not given that. The convents were closed, and these 2 phrases emerge. I found these, and it was a shock when I found them. So that famous phrase, a woman's place is in the home, that was John Calvin. And there we have it. Those are his dates. So you can see at what point that phrase comes about. And then this is Martin Luther. He says, the wife should stay at home and look after the affairs of the household as one who has been deprived of the ability of administering those affairs that are outside and concern the state. Now, I'm not putting all the blame on them, because then there are centuries where these ideas of the domestic sphere being female, the public sphere being male, that gets bedded in. And as industrialization and urbanization and global expansion all increase, that division between men and women beds down. Now, what can we do to challenge this? How can we move forward? This is where we can start looking at these three examples that I mentioned. And I hope by looking at these, I'm showing you not just kings and queens, not just the few, the elite, but I want to explore the issues of war and military activity. I want to explore knowledge and education, and I want to explore power and politics. And this is where I go off script and start walking around and waving my arms about at you all. So here we have a famous painting by Frank Bernard Dixie, Victorian-era painting, showing Vikings doing Viking things. So you've got your big, burly men. This one has got a horned helmet on, despite the fact he's pushing a boat out to sea. There's flame, there's fire, there's water. It's all the elements, and it's very powerful and mobile. And the Vikings, our version of the Vikings, is very much a post-Victorian invention. There was a real race at this period of nation building, nation expanding in the middle of the 19th century, where the Germans wanted to lay claim to the Vikings, the English wanted to lay claim to the Vikings, all in the spirit of being the most brave seafarers that have ever been recorded. And of course, think about the English Navy in that. But it's all contrived, and it's all very much pieced together to serve the state. And now we have this idea of a Viking as a beardy, kind of bulky bloke with an axe jumping off a long ship. And of course, the horned helmet. That you still go to a fancy dress shop, say I'm going as a Viking, get handed a horned helmet. There is no evidence that Vikings wore horned helmets at all. In fact, a horn helmet is a very bad idea in battle. You can stand out from a mile off, puts you off balance, one knock, and you've got a horn going through your skull. Really bad for battle. Where did the horn helmet come from? It's a 19th century invention. When Wagner's Ring Cycle was being performed, the costume designer was standing right at the back of the theatre. And it's a story of Viking age time, and you've got the goodies and the baddies. And what the designer thought was, well, I need to be able to tell them apart from the back. So we'll put wings on the horns of the goodies and horns on the helmets of the baddies. And from that point onwards, it has stuck. It is nothing to do with Vikings. It's everything to do with a 19th century German costume designer. So think of that next time you go into a fancy dress shop. But as our understanding of the Viking period has started to expand, even the term is fraught with trouble. When we talk about Viking, really we're talking about Scandinavian, but that is a combination of Norsemen from Norway, Swedes, Icelanders. It's a complicated landscape, and this catch-all term is very reductive. And archaeology is really helping us to put some other dimension onto this version of the Vikings that we've inherited. So I'm taking you now to Birka. This is, I like to call it the Slough service station of the Scandinavian world, because all the roads went past it, all the routes connecting the Baltic, Russia, all the way down to Spain, Northern Africa, they would be passing by Birka. And as a result, it becomes a hotbed of trade and exchange. But also as a result, it means that an awful lot of valuable commodities are coming in and out of this place on a daily basis. It would be excellent pickings for a smash and grab raid when you've got Islamic coins rolling up in ships and you've got very expensive Swedish furs going out. So Birka, of course, ended up having to defend itself. And its very position in the landscape lends itself to that. The other reason that Birka is such a fantastic example to study is because it was only inhabited for 200 years at the very high point of the Viking Age, from about 750 AD up to about 950 AD. It was then abandoned, and it becomes sort of this petri dish, this example of Viking life that's preserved. You can see in this map here that there's a huge cliff face that sort of wraps around the port city. Can you see there? It's in grey. And what they then ended up doing was putting barracks, wooden barracks, all the way around to make a protective wall for the city. And then on the waterfront, they put barricades as well. So there's a floating market. Some big ships wouldn't even be allowed into the port at Birka. But think about this as a noisy, busy, exciting, diverse place. You would have people speaking different languages. You would have different religions being discussed. I mean, there's a wonderful example from a similar trading town just along in Helge of a jade Buddha that's been buried with a Viking. So we know that they're engaging along the Silk Road. It's a vibrant place, and archaeology has started to bring it to life. Now, right back to the 1900s, this fabulous archaeology, Stolper started to excavate Birka. He knew he was onto something. There were hundreds of burials, but of all of them that he excavated, the one that he got most excited was this one here, BJ581. And you can see on this that it's right by the garrison, the army barracks. You can see it's on the coast, and it's under a mound, so it would have been visible from the sea. And it's got a huge boulder that was raised up on top of it. That has got to make it the most significant burial. When he moved the boulder and he dug down and found what was underneath it, he discovered a chamber. And in this chamber was a figure who'd either been sat on some sort of a throne or possibly on a horse's saddle. And at the feet of the figure had been sacrificed 2 horses, a mare and a stallion. And they'd been buried at the feet of the individual. And then all around the individual was a full armory of weapons. Now, this is really unusual. In an early medieval burial, you might get a knife. People used knives very regularly. You may get bows and arrows or a spear. But here you have the full lot, plus a sword, plus a shield. It is a huge investment of weaponry into the ground, because once you bury these things, they can't be used again. So this is saying that the person being buried is important. But there was something else, because on their lap, Stolper found a board game. And this is a board game called Knefatafel. I don't want to say that later on. It's a tough one to say, Knefatafel. It's a defensive game. If you think about the origins of chess, chess was all about strategy and thinking 2 steps ahead of your opponent, and Knefatafel was the Viking equivalent. So having this board game on the individual's lap makes you think maybe there's some sort of a military strategist, that they're connected to the army, they're defending this town, and they're being honoured by the city after they've died. So Stolper said, we're going to call this the Birka Warrior Grave, and it is the single best Viking warrior grave ever discovered. And so it remained for 70 years. Then an osteoarchaeologist had a little look at the bones and said, there's some odd aspects to the hip bones here. The figure is about 170 centimetres, which is about average height for a male at this point, but the femurs were slightly different formed. Anyway, nobody listened to her. And it took another 30, 40 years before, in 2017, a team from Stockholm decided to test the DNA of the skeleton. They took DNA from the teeth and DNA from the bones, and they ran it. And they ran it again, and they ran it again. And while the actual genomes were slightly decayed over, because it's been over 1,000 years in the ground, the chromosomes themselves were intact, and there were only 2 X chromosomes throughout. This was not the Birka Warrior, this was the Birka Warrior Woman. And I'd been writing about female Vikings for a while. I'd written children's books where the main protagonist is a shield maiden. And I knew from the religion, from the storytelling, the myths, the art, that gender fluidity in the Scandinavian world is really evident. Even one of the most famous saga stories about Thor, the god of thunder, is that he dresses up and gets married in a wedding dress to try and defeat the king of the giants. So they had a slightly different attitude towards dress, towards gender. But this sent shockwaves. 2,000 internet accounts started to spread this news of this discovery. And there was outcry on the internet. They said women can do a lot of things, but they cannot fight. They cannot fight like a Viking. We refuse to accept that this warrior burial is that of a woman. This is in 2017. I was horrified, and the team themselves was so bullied and intimidated as a result of this that they actually had to pretty much go into hiding as a result. It's terrible that we are living in a time where we can't accept that that is sort of the final frontier of what women are capable of doing. And so the Birka Warrior, these are the Kneffertaffel pieces, by the way, and this is a possible reconstruction. Other things we know about her are that she possibly came from Eastern Europe. Some of her clothing shows that they're not native Scandinavian. Regardless, what we have is the most high-status burial in Birka, connected with the barracks, with weapons. We don't know whether she actually fought, because the next thing that was then said was, listen, if I can see evidence that a woman has actually fought in battle, then I'll believe that women could fight. And so the year later, a skeleton was discovered, a woman with slashes from a sword that had healed up, which proved that she had been in battle, healed, and then gone on to battle again. But it's very hard to prove something when an audience doesn't want it to be proved to them. Nevertheless, I think it's important to have some caveats with this. Yes, the Birka Warrior Woman has 2 X chromosomes, but how did she identify? How did she appear to her community? How did she represent herself? How did she speak? Wear her hair? Her clothes? How was she treated by the people around her? We do not know. And so it's one step to say that it's a woman. It's another to build up a picture of the society of which she was a part. And in the chapter, I go into detail about Viking society, Viking myth, Viking legend, Viking life. And I show that, yes, it was very, very possible for women to have a role in military leadership. So that's my first example, and I wanted to kind of get us to think about maybe why we idolize military leaders. Why is it great that some women go into battle and wield a sword? What does that make them any greater? Why do we pinpoint so much of our historical events according to battles and military leaders? But I also want us to start challenging this notion that maybe women could do all the things that men could. And that brings me on to my second example. She is my absolute favourite. I shouldn't have favourites. It's like having a favourite child, but Hildegard of Bingen is my favourite medieval woman, partly because she lived for such a long time. It's good. If you want to make history, try living longer. 81 she got to, and she was born in 1098, and she lived for 81 years, so she lived through this incredibly important century, the 12th century, when there was so much change, when there was heresy around every corner, when there was threat and change and transformation, but also intellectual revolutions taking place. And she was lucky because she was based in the very heart of where this sort of intellectual renaissance was taking place. And that's in the Rhineland-Palatinate in Germany. When she was born, there's a story that she was already considered quite unusual. Hildegard had a nanny and was out walking with this nanny one day. And she said to her nanny, "Nanny, can you see things that aren't there?" And I think that's always, I've seen lots of horror films, and that's the start of something awful. But the nanny said, "What do you mean, Hildegard?" And she said, "Well, I'm looking at that cow over there, and it's pregnant. And inside I can see the calf, and it's got like a ginger spot here and a black spot here. Can you not see that?" And she's like, "No, I can't." Went home, told Hildegard's mother. A week later, Hildegard's mother went, found the calf, and it was exactly as Hildegard had described. So I think they thought, right, I don't think Hildegard's suited for just marrying the local baker and settling down. She's an unusual child. What other options are open to her? And the option available at that point was for her to be under the mentorship of this slightly older woman. So she goes in when she's about 12, 13, and the tutor, her mentor, is about 16, a few years older than her. And they live together in this small monastic community, female community, that's attached to a much, much larger male monastery called Disibodenberg. And I visited it, and it's the single most exciting place I've visited. It's very hard to get to. It's on the top of a hill, and you really don't expect there to be anything. And when you get there, you can see the actual outlines of everything, the chapter house, the cloister, the church. And you can stand where Hildegard was, and it's just a beautiful place to really connect with her. And for years, Hildegard had been experiencing visions. Now, this you might recognize, it's from the front of my book, but this is known as Hildegard's cosmic egg. Read into it what you will. The reason Hildegard is so extraordinary, and I like to say this often, she was Leonardo da Vinci, centuries before Leonardo da Vinci, and better than Leonardo da Vinci, because she finished her projects. She's a polymath. She was a scientist. She's still known as the mother of the natural sciences in Germany. She studied stones and fauna and flora. She wrote poetry. She wrote plays. She invented a language. She was an artist, and something I think a lot of people know her best for is she was a musician. If you do one thing for me tonight, go home on YouTube, look up Hildegard of Bingen songs. They are extraordinary. It's written for female voices, and she jumps 2 octaves sometimes with the choral pieces. It's just magnificent, soaring music. So she's a polymath. She's the ultimate polymath. And what I think Hildegard was trying to do in all of these instances is she's pushing against the limits of what we know. She's trying to see if we can get to the untouchable, the indescribable, the out of reach. She's trying language, she's trying music, she's trying art. And she continues to keep trying. And look at these images. This one in particular, it's supposed to represent the Trinity, Father, Son, Holy Spirit. But can you see how it's sort of shimmering? And she's done something really unusual in the scriptorium, which is, you'll know that a lot of medieval manuscripts used gold to gild it, to give it that shimmer. She insisted that they use silver. Now, silver's no good because it deteriorates, it stains the vellum. But the reason she insists on it was because she was like, these are what my visions look like. They have this metallic quality. So, and she describes them this way. So she says, when she's having her visions, she's existing in the shadow of the living light. When she's in a vision, she feels it physically like a trembling flame or a cloud stirred by the clear air. And a lot of work has been done on Hildegard's visions, and the most logical explanation for what she was experiencing was a migraine. Has anybody in this room had a migraine before? Yeah? It's that the idea of an aura, that it comes out from the center. The metallic, a lot of people describe a metallic taste when they're having a migraine, and the vibrating edges. And so Hildegard seems to have been having something we can medically make sense of, experiencing a migraine. But what she goes on to do with that is make it something empowering. Because she's having these moments that take her out of the earthly towards the spiritual, she declares herself a visionary. Now, today, that might be seen as unusual. In the 12th century, she is carving out a path. But what she does very cleverly is she gets male religious people, including Barnard of Clairvaux and the Pope, on side. So that very quickly after she writes her first book, which becomes an instant bestseller, and she goes on a book tour, she is being held up by the men and the women around her. And this is something we might find unusual, isn't it? We might think that an exceptional woman like that would be accused of heresy or burnt at the stake or witchcraft. But she's not. She is built up, to the point where she is the personal advisor to the emperor, the kings and queens of Europe, and the Pope. She is playing international politics. This is a letter that she writes to the archbishop, telling him off. Listen to the tone of this. You evil deceivers who labour to subvert the Catholic faith, you are wavering and soft, and thus cannot avoid the poisonous arrows of human corruption. And after you pour out your lust in the poisonous seed of fornication, you pretend to pray and falsely assume an air of sanctity, which is more unworthy in my eyes than the stinky mire. She's getting away with sending this letter to the archbishop. And she is playing politics, and she does it in more than one way. At the time, in the 12th century, there's a real rise in anti-Semitism. It's quite awful what's happening. In places like York, at Clifford's Tower, the Jewish population is massacred. But Hildegard takes a stance on this, and she is opposed to it. So she will produce texts that talk about the church being made up of two halves. The new church, the Christian church, ecclesia, and the old church, synagoga, which is the Jewish heritage, the Old Testament. And so she is not afraid to get involved in the cutting-edge politics of her time. And she also does other things you might not expect of a nun. This is her recipe for how a woman can abort a baby. A 12th century nun is giving an instruction for something. Now, in her case, it's because she worries about the health of the mother. If the pregnancy is going to cause illness to the mother, then they should be able to abort the child. That is something we are having a conversation about internationally right now. And Hildegard did it 800 years ago. And I know we've got school people in the room today, but she also gave the very first description of the female orgasm. This is it. It's heady stuff. I'm not going to read it out. You can read it online. But she was dealing with these issues that we would never assume a nun would be addressing. She was of her time. And this is the thing. We have a problem writing about individuals from the past, which is that they become exceptions. It's the exceptionalism in history that is such a problem. 50 women you should know about. One page, it's Coco Chanel, flip it over, you're looking at Marie Curie. No connection. But Hildegard shines a light on the moment, the society, the communities of which she was a part. Yes, she's an extraordinary person, but she's only extraordinary because of the place, the time, and the people around her that are building her up and allowing her to be exceptional. And she's not alone, because just down the road, this manuscript was produced. So it was Harold of Landsberg. She was running a local convent, and they came up with the first complete historical encyclopedia. Unfortunately, it was lost during the wars, but there was a facsimile made of it. And this is the cover page. Look at that editorial board. All women. We still struggle to get an all-female editorial board. So she wasn't alone, and there were brilliant women all around her. And they weren't living a hard life here. This is a description of how the women in Hildegard's abbey used to behave. On feast days, this is a criticism, by the way, from a nun down the road who thinks that Hildegard's having far too much fun at her abbey. On feast days, your nuns stand in church chanting psalms with unbound hair, and for decorative purposes wear long white silk veils which reach down to the ground. On their heads they wear crowns of woven gold, and they adorn their fingers with gold rings. And they do all this, although the first shepherd of the church forbade such things. So they are cosplaying down the way in Hildegard's abbey, but they're having a lovely, luxurious, fantastic existence where they're singing and putting on plays and writing and achieving everything. So I think that flies in the face of what we might assume a medieval convent was like. It's not the rule at all, I must stress that. Hildegard, her nuns, her environment are unusual. But that these women existed was important. Now, I know I'm going to run out of time. And I'm very briefly just going to introduce you to the very last woman, which is from the high medieval period. And I will leave you with teasers about her that you can then go and download the notes from the Gresham College site and find out more about her. But I want to tell you about a woman who was not a queen, but a king. Not Regina, but Rex. And that is this woman, Jadwiga of Poland. In 1997, she was declared one of the patron saints of Europe. And she ruled Poland as a king. The whole story of how and why is tied up to this enormously powerful court in Poland, Lithuania. We have such a Western-focused kind of way of doing history here in the British Isles that we don't look to this area of Europe. We call it Eastern Europe and associate it with the Soviet bloc. But for much of the medieval period, this was Central Europe. This was where the power, the courtliness, all the intellectual developments, democracy itself was being formed here in Poland, in Lithuania, and in and around Hungary. And I had a whole selection of objects that I connected with when I wrote my book to get me in touch with this woman from the past. Now she's held up as a national icon in Poland. She is a saint, and so she becomes this sort of two-dimensional sacred being who's sort of somewhere between heaven and earth, but not real. But Jadwiga that I've discovered, by going back to the objects she held, back to the books she read, back to the streets that she walked on in Kraków, she is feisty, she is intelligent, she is sophisticated. This is the area I'm talking about, Central Europe. And this is the document that her father had signed. Now, how different history would be if other male rulers had decided to do what Louis the Great, Jadwiga's father, decided to do. He wrote this document, a deal with the nobles of Poland that said, I only have daughters, I have 3 daughters, no sons. But when I die, I want you to recognize them as the king. And this document says Rex, king. And this document was signed. And when he died, his 2 daughters, Mary and Jadwiga, the 2 surviving ones, are the only 2 women in European medieval history to be known as king, not queen. I could go on and tell you about her romances, how her life story has been elaborated and glorified. Her own bones were discovered at a point when Poland simply didn't exist on the map. And this portrait was made on the basis of her bones. Now, she doesn't look very medieval. She looks a little bit 19th century to me here. But nonetheless, this is a picture that is found in households across Poland. And these are some of the things I know she was in front of. Her crucifix that's still in the cathedral. She commissioned this rationale as well. It's got her initials on it. And this beautiful little box that has romance stories all over the sides of it. She owned this, looked on it, held it. But her arms purse, showing these stories from the romance of Tristan and Isolde. This is a woman who is connected to international court politics. She is also known as Jadwiga of Anjou. She's part of the Angevin royal tradition. She is immersed in chivalry, courtly love, romance. All the different objects show stories from the romances. And this is my favorite, and this is my last slide. This is the place where I felt closer to a medieval woman than I've ever felt before, because this is the Florian Psalter. This is a book that was written for Jadwiga. Now, we know she spoke up to 7 different languages, could read, could write, was highly educated, highly sophisticated. And her best friend, who was the Bishop of Kraków, had this manuscript made for her. It's in 3 languages, and it's got parallel text, and hidden all the way through the margins are little puzzles, scientific curiosities, creatures, women doing unusual things. But most importantly, can you see Yoda and Gandalf? Yeah, this is a woman with a sense of humour. It's not Yoda and Gandalf, but it sums up this idea that this is a woman who is far more than the version we've been told. She is interesting, intelligent, curious, funny, brave. And that's the woman I've been trying to connect with across time. And I think every one of us now has the power to be our own detectives, our own historical detectives, going forward finding the people that have been written out of history. So just in conclusion, we don't need to simply accept the versions of history that we have inherited. We need to scrutinize them and ask why we have been told stories from the past in the ways that we have. Who does history serve, and what could be achieved if we look with fresh eyes at the evidence? What I've found is that by looking beyond the great male narratives, complex and diverse perspectives emerge. And I found this personally empowering. When I know that remarkable women like the Birka Warrior Woman, Hildegard of Bingen, and King Jadwiga went before me, I feel like I have foundations upon which to build my own agency. You cannot be what you cannot see. They also open up the possibility of rediscovering a whole host of ignored people from the past with whom we can identify and find inspiration. Can looking for women in the past help us build a better future? Well, if we can find ourselves in the past and acknowledge people like us have always been there, then we can see ourselves contributing to a more equal present and future. Thank you, everybody.